is collecting plants that they can eat all winter long. If it's too hot on the surface in the summer, they have to hide from the heat and they don't collect big enough hay piles. That could be a really big problem for pikas. Another tricky thing about pikas is we think of them as really cold adapted, but they actually are not used to things being too cold. They're used to it being about freezing, but not much colder. Can anybody tell me, is anybody in the Scouts or has a lot of outdoor experience, in the winter if you get stuck, how should you stay warm? What should you build for yourself?
Organizer?
An igloo?
An igloo or a snow cave, something like that, right. What does that do for you?
Yeah.
The snow acts as a blanket and keeps you warm.
Yeah, absolutely. The snow insulates you, it's like a blanket, and it keeps you warm. It'll trap your body heat, because you're a mammal, you produce heat inside your body, and the key is, the reason we wear clothes, the clothes aren't warm themselves, right? The point of clothes is to trap your body heat close to your body so you stay warm. Pikas, of course, have a really nice fur coat, but sometimes they need even more help, and having a nice layer of snow acts like a blanket and will protect them from really cold temperatures, which is pretty cool. So if we skip forward, we already saw the weasels, so we'll go past that to the one that says Okatona Princeps distribution. This is the places where pikas live all across North America. This is one species of pika called the American pika. There are actually 28 species in the world, but just one of them here in Colorado. And I've highlighted an area, there's a red box around an area called the Great Basin. The Great Basin is called that because it's like a big bathtub where pikas can only live in mountain ranges that stick up out of the desert. And those mountain ranges are kind of separate from each other. The thing about this area is pikas have disappeared from 10 of 25 populations where they used to be, all right? 25 locations where they were have lost their pikas and they haven't come back. So if we skip to the next slide, there are lots of different reasons potentially, and I've told you about some of the ideas we have for why climate might affect pikas. Let's think about how changing climate might affect pikas. Let's come up with some examples. I'm looking at the hypotheses slide that has a cloud on the left-hand side. So what do you guys think? Based on what you know now, what are some ways that pikas could be affected by climate change?
Jacob?
It may get too hot.
They might get too hot. And what will that do to them?
It will make it where their body can't produce enough, or can.
Yeah, their bodies will overheat and they can have heat stress. The other possibility is they'll go under the rocks, but then they're not collecting plants, right? So their hay piles might be bad. What else?
Organizer?
If it gets too cold, that they could like freeze, even though that they're used to the cold weather, they're not used to it being extremely cold.
Absolutely, and remember what usually protects them from cold, because it can be minus 40 in the alpine, but they're usually protected by what?
No.
Okay, so how else could climate change affect that?
Kale?
It could become drier and there won't be as much snowfall, so when they dig under the snow, there's not as much to insulate them. So
Exactly, very good. Basically, their blanket that insulates them is too thin, and so they won't be protected from the heat as well. Very good.
Zoe?
What else might happen? Any other ideas?
Zoe Owens?
The snow, there might be a bunch of snow, so that, and then, you know, how you said that they make the hay pile?
I didn't hear that very well.
How the snow, in the area, the alpine, they might get too much snow, and it's like, too deep, and how they were trying to make a hay pile. They couldn't make it because they couldn't find food under the snow.
Jamie, I may need you to repeat that. I can't quite hear. Something about hay piles.
She said, I think what she was saying was maybe that if there was too much snow in the winter, they might have a hard time finding your hay piles.
Mhm.
Did I get that right?
Yeah, very good. And there are some issues. They might, if we get really, really long winters. 3 years ago, we had really, really big winter. And I couldn't get to some of my sites until Labor Day, until September, because they were still covered in snow. So if we get a really big snow year, it can be just as bad as a really low snow year, because Pika's hay piles are only so big, right? And they would have to survive under the snow for longer. I have a comment or question right in front there.
If it rains too much, then the snow would like kind of turn into ice to where they can't dig the little holes to make them.
Yeah.
Places.
Right, very good. Yeah, snow can be different in different places, right? And you know what? It's not actually the snow that insulates pikas from cold. It's the air spaces between all the snowflakes that insulate them. And so if the snow gets squished down and turned into ice, there's no air in there anymore to insulate and trap heat. So snow is a much better insulator than ice is, and you're right, if you get rain on top of it, it can squish it down, and it's not as good at insulating. So what I do, you guys, is I study pikas here in the Southern Rockies. That means I study them in Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming. Excuse me. And what I wanted to know is, based on what we knew about pikas disappearing in the Great Basin, I wanted to know if they were disappearing here too. So I visited a bunch of places where we knew pikas had lived before 1980, and then I revisited them in 2008, 2009, 2010, and 2011 to see if pikas were still there, and to see if there was any consistent trend in where pikas disappeared. Are there certain climate traits or things about the plants at the certain site that change why pikas disappear in some places and not others? So that's what my research was, but I know you guys are going to be coming up with some hypotheses and examples. So you guys are going to be doing a little bit of what I did when I started my research, which was trying to figure out why pikas might disappear. And I can tell you the good news is that pikas are doing better here in Colorado than they are in the Great Basin. So that's very good news. A lot of our habitat is better for them here than it is in the Great Basin, but we have lost a couple of the populations here, so we are still worried about them. But they're not disappearing as much as they have in other parts of their range. We can go to the final slide. There's just another reminder of my email and any questions. Any more questions that you need to do your investigations, you guys?
Zoe Owens?
I live in Green.
Loud voice, because you can't hear from back there. Actually, go up there closer by table 2 and ask your question. Up there by Ellie, go.
I was wondering, pikas are really, really cute. Why can't you just grab one and like use it as a pet?
That's a really, really good question. That's a great question. A lot of people have wanted pikas as pets. If you've ever noticed, if you've ever been to a zoo, pikas are never in zoos either. Because pikas are, they have that really high metabolism, meaning that that's what keeps them warm all the time, right? Their metabolism keeps their engine going so that they stay warm in the winter. Their metabolism's running really, really high. They're like a marathon runner or something like that has a really high metabolism. It also means they stress out really, really easily. They, as an example, somebody had some pikas in a lab in Fort Collins at CSU, and they had a bunch of pikas in that lab, and they were studying their behavior and things. Somebody brought a dog in to the lab next door, not even to the room where the pikas were. All the pikas died. They had little heart attacks. They all died because they got so stressed out. So pikas stress out super, super easily. They're very stressful little buggers, easily stressed little guys. And so that's why we can't have them as pets, and you don't see them in zoos or anything like that. They need to have the protection of their talus to stay comfortable and not stress out too much. So very good question.
Morgan Nesser?
Is it possible for, like if you're up on, like if you're up in the Alpines and you have one of your dogs, is it possible for one of your dogs to go and actually find a pika?
It does happen, and we always ask that if you are hiking in the alpine with your dog, that you try to keep them close to you, either on a leash or if they listen well, just keep them close and keep them from chasing. Because pikas are so easily stressed, it's really best if your dog doesn't chase them. They'll often chase both pikas and marmots, and that's really hard on our wildlife to get chased by a big dog. It's pretty rare. A dog has to be pretty darn fast to catch a pika because they're very fast. But they do catch marmots more often, and certainly they are capable of catching pikas, so we'd ask that you keep your dog close by you so it doesn't chase up.
Jacob?
Why don't we stress them out when we go up in the hills where a dog is in?
Why don't people stress them out?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. They actually, it seems like as long as you're not actively chasing them, and as long as they have their territory with their rocks so they know where to hide, as long as they're close to their territory and can run under the rocks, they seem to do just fine, and they'll actually come out. I call them the terriers of the small mammal world. So you know how little dogs seem yippier than big dogs? Pikas are very much the same way. They think they're about 10 times bigger than they are. So if they're in their territory, they're very confident. And they say, this is my territory, and I don't want you in my territory. And they will actually come right up to you and go, eek! Eek! They make this squeaking noise, which means, get out of my house, right? And it's not very threatening. It's quite cute, but they think it's very threatening. And they think that they're running you off. So when they're in their territory and they feel confident, they're not very, we don't seem to stress them out. They'll live right next to trails and roads as long as they have a safe place to go.
Zoe?
How long would they live? Like, how many years?
That's a good question. They usually live about 4 or 5 years. The most, like a lot of animals, most pikas die in their first year just because they have to find a new territory and they have to leave their home nest, and that can be a hard thing for a little pika to do and make it safely without getting picked off by a weasel. But once they survive that first year, they usually live to 4 or 5 years old. The oldest pika we ever have known about was 7, so not very long.
Jacob?
Do they have babies every year?
They do. They can have babies their first, the summer after they were born, they can start having babies. But they're not, you think of rabbits as having a lot of babies. That's another thing that's not as much like regular rabbits about pikas, is that they have smaller litters. They usually only have between 3 and 5 babies. And sometimes they have 2 litters in a year, but often only one of them survives. They have an early litter and a late litter, and depending on when the snow melts, whichever litter is there when the snow has just melted and there's lots of plants is the litter that's going to do the best. So they do have babies every year, and they usually just have 3 or 4.
Morgan?
Is it possible for, how a pika looks like a little mouse or something? Why aren't they related to them instead, because they're related to the rabbits? I would expect them to be related to the mice and rats.
Yeah, right. That's a good question. So one thing to know is that if pika's closest cousin is a rabbit and hare, the next closest cousins are the mice and rats and squirrels. rodents are a cousin group to the lagomorphs. So they are kind of closely related, but I want you to notice a few things about pikas. Notice that they don't have a tail at all. All the pikas, rabbits, etc. Rabbits sometimes have the little cotton tail, right? But they never have a very big tail. If you think about all the rodents, squirrels, mice, etc., they have a long tail. Some other things, they have special teeth. They actually don't just have Bugs Bunny teeth. Behind the Bugs Bunny teeth, they have a second set of what we call incisors, which are those big Bugs Bunny teeth. They have extra teeth behind there. So the extra teeth also, it's kind of a unique lagomorph thing to be coprophagic, that they eat their own poop. That's something rabbits tend to do more. So no tail, different teeth, all that stuff. Actually, that's part of why they're more closely related to rabbits. And we've done the genetics, and it all seems to make sense that they're more of a rabbit than a mouse.
Zoe?
Are Pegas one of those kind of families that once they have their children, they just mate them? And also, when they mate, do they just leave their husband and then just like go have their babies in a different area, or do they stay with them for like how long do they stay?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of this is a little bit of a mystery because it all happens under the snow. So we don't totally know, but we do know a little bit. We know that pikas, they're very, very territorial, and that means males and females are territorial to each other too. So you can have two pikas that will come together to be parents, but they only make peace for those couple days when they breed, and then they separate out again, and they are enemies again. Part of why pikas are calling, just like they call at humans, they call at all the pikas around them to say, this is my hay pile, not yours. You can imagine if you spend all summer provisioning your pantry and your refrigerator for the winter, you would want to protect that very carefully because you couldn't survive the winter. Well, they definitely protect that, but they do that by making the calls that I made earlier at each other. So males and females are very territorial with each other. They won't let anybody near their hay pile. So they make a brief truce. They say, okay, we'll get together to have some babies, but then you're out of here again. And they're enemies again. There is some evidence that when a female has a litter and is feeding them her milk, sometimes the male will bring some food for her. But that doesn't happen super often. Most of the time, they're really separate from each other. They just come together to mate. And then the babies, once they're born, they stay with their mom for about a month, which is not very long. They stay with their mom for about a month, and then they're kicked out of the nest. And at that point, the mom treats them just like any other pika and says, you've got to get out of my territory now. And they will be treated just like anybody else that says, hey, no, this is my hay pile. You need to go make your own hay pile now. You're a big pika. You can do it, you know. And so it's kind of a tough world for a little pika. They only have a month with mom, and then they get kicked out.
CJ?
Do pikas fight?
They do fight a little bit, especially they're known, it's kind of like dogs where puppies need to kind of be put in their place, right? So an adult dog will say, hey, little guy, get it together. Same way, the baby pikas get kicked out of their mom's nest and they have to go find their own place to make a hay pile. They're going to test to figure out where everybody else's territories are, right? In doing that, they're going to enter other pikas' territories and get yelled at. It starts with yelling, and if they don't listen to the yelling, they start to chase each other, and they can actually get so nasty that they'll rip chunks out of each other's butts, basically. It gets a little bit nasty, but most of the time they just yell at each other. Sometimes they do get into fights, but it's chasing fights, so they don't usually fight head on. One of them is just chasing the other and grabs a chunk of their rump.
Corey Messer?
So do the males fight each other to get the female, or is it just that they come together and then they separate?
Yeah, everything we've seen, it seems like the males don't compete. The males just find a female nearby, and and it's more about who the female will let near her, more than males fighting over females.
Any other questions? I have a couple questions, Liesl. If you think of
Okay.
any others, we still have some time. If you do, Liesl.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the second to last slide, I noticed when I clicked on it, it kind of showed a diagram of some things, and when I looked at it, I started wondering: is there is this hinting at potential disease issues? And if so, what can you tell us a little more about diseases with pikas?
Sure, absolutely. So, yeah, if you go back to that, you see there are little green bugs, and there are black bugs with green stuff on them, and then a little dead pika with a green thing in it. That's the idea there, that potentially, we don't know much about pikas and diseases. They do carry some, in Asia, they've been known to carry some things like SARS, which is a disease that some people in Asia had a big outbreak of a few years ago. We know the big thing is that pikas tend to be pretty isolated from other mammals because they're up in the alpine. But as climate change is shifting everybody upslope, a lot of the rodents are kind of notorious for carrying diseases. They have a lot of fleas and stuff. That's those black things there. It could be fleas or ticks or something else that has diseases in them. And as rodents, things like wood rats and stuff, move upslope, they might bring some of those diseases with them. And we actually do suspect that something like that happened to a population up in Montana. They died off really quickly in a huge number. And so we do think there's potential for disease to come upslope. It's similar to things like malaria is spreading to new places because mosquitoes can, the specific mosquito that carries malaria is able to move up in elevation now in parts of Central America. And so just like that, where the mosquito moves and so does the disease, we think potentially same thing could happen to pikas. But that's a really good subject of research that we need to know more about.
What happens if they like eat the fly and then the mate comes along and they mate? Would she die having babies, or